Thanks everybody for coming. I've got a bunch of projects that I'm going to kind of cover today. As Jessica mentioned, really talking about this role of the physical space, information and technology together, and how that can support collaboration, inquiry, and the facilitation of that by teachers. I'm also going to talk a little bit in the process of this about the design of those spaces as well, because I think that's really important, and sort of in several cases the process through which we went through to design these, so you kind of understand. Because I think it's really important to know that these things don't just appear, right? It's not just like the first time you do it, you're like, awesome, it worked, and I'm done, right? It's much more complicated than that, and so we'll get to talk a bit about that. Just to give you a sense of where we start from, a lot of my work is really based around these ideas of authentic and collective inquiry. That is, I want kids to engage in learning that sort of connects to them in the real world and lives, where they understand whatever that domain is, particularly within STEM, that it's meaningful to them. We all know these far too often, these refrains of kids saying, I don't need to learn math or physics because I'm never going to use it in the real world. Yeah, and also, that was awesome. Unexpected, but great. And also this idea around learning communities, that we want kids to work together to collectively generate knowledge, right? Really, it's not about silos of individual information living and existing and learning all by yourself. That isn't really how anything happens in the real world, so why are we doing that in classrooms, right? And so, not surprisingly, connected to this is the way we think and design classrooms themselves. This picture on the left I found from Wikipedia from 1890, okay? So we're over 125 years ago, and the one on the right is from within the last 10 years, and they're the exact same configurations. Why is it with everything else we've learned about how people learn, about how society, how we collaborate and do everything, that the classrooms haven't changed? In fact, it's crazy. These kids look even more bored than the ones here. Like, half of them are like scratching their head, not paying attention. We haven't changed the spaces in which we learn to the realities of how we actually know people, interact, collaborate, and learn. And another challenge with this is, when we think about technology, right? And the role that technology can have in these spaces. And questions arise about why we should even integrate technology in these classrooms, right? We can put kids in front of a computer, a multi-touch screen, a tabletop, right? But far too often, we don't actually ask why. Like, what are the goals for it? What's the kind of learning and collaboration we're trying to support, right? And particularly the kinds of practices and competencies that are key to working with these kind of technologies that we are more and more often seeing as critical to the kinds of 21st century skills and practices that we see in our own lives, in our work, and the work of others more broadly. So, and in addition to this, with all of these technologies, we're seeing an explosion of data, right? Lots of data being generated by the interactions and the work that students are doing, right? And a lot of it is real time. So part of my question is not only how do we intelligently put these technologies into these spaces, but what can we do with the data that comes out of it, right? What can we learn in ways that are both like retrospective after they've done it, but also critically in real time, right? We're getting all of this data, and so we're only now starting to ask questions about what that can do to help inform the teaching, help students learn, help them connect with each other. And so I've mentioned technology, but I want to make it very clear that when I think of it, it's technology for learning communities, okay? We need to develop the tools and spaces to support the kinds of models of learning that we kind of want to support, rather than subvert the models of learning to fit technology, right? Far too often we see that where people are like, okay, we're just going to change how these kids learn because we have a tablet and it works this way, right? Well, that's highly problematic, right? We really should be asking the hard questions about how we make this work, and if it doesn't, then we need to design the technologies to do it. So broadly, these are the three questions that I think could really drive my work. How do we design technology-infused learning environments to support collaborative inquiry? That is, kids working together to investigate authentic and personally meaningful problems, right? How can these connected ecologies of different technologies, the space and information, support learning at the individual, small group, and whole class levels? And because this sort of comes from the fact that we know there's a lot of work collaboration is an effective means of learning, but not always, right? Sometimes it's really important to have kids, allow them to sit back and reflect on their own, generate ideas, right? And so how do we design it to allow this movement between these? And just like collaboration works in small groups, there's a lot that we can learn when we have the whole class talking together, right? Similar ideas, challenging each other, getting to work together. So how do we design them to allow for this flow across these different social planes in ways that are effective, right? And then how do we leverage multidimensional data to inform learning, teaching, and research? When I talk about multidimensional data, I'm talking about log data, video data, positioning data about students in the classroom. In some cases, it could be eye tracking. It could be all of these things. We have a lot of different streams now that we can look at. And I think the real power is when we understand how those complement each other to understand what's going on in the classroom. So, one of the first things that, this was my PhD work, was we developed this technology framework called Sales Smart Space. And it was a technology infrastructure that allowed people to connect in real time over multiple devices. It could be tablets, laptops, multi-touch tables. And it was a real-time messaging system that would take information about what kids were doing, right? And it would actually then use a publication subscription model that could send things out to the kids in real time. And then we had a couple agents also that would monitor what was happening in real time and adapt. Give kids materials as they needed it, put them into groups, all of this really complicated real-time stuff. But that took about 4 years of work to get to there. So we didn't just suddenly build a system and it was working, right? In fact, the first thing we did is we got a room that was about this size in a school, and they didn't know what to do with it. So they offered it to us, and we're like, yes, we will take the small classroom. In fact, it probably wasn't even this big. And what we did is, the first thing I did is I was like, well, how do we think about this room as a different kind of configuration? So what I did is what everybody would do, which is I covered the entire room in Velcro. And then I attached Velcro to the backs of all of these different monitors. And so we worked with students in classrooms, and we just kind of just said, what happens if we do a 4x4 one on a wall and kids put things up? Or we do a couple, 2x4s or 2x2s all over the place. What happens if we make a 1x16 that wraps around the whole room? Because we didn't understand. We wanted to ask questions about what it kind of afforded in these spaces in these different configurations. And we did a few very basic pilot studies with it. And so then what we did is we worked with a teacher, and we realized that these large screens were actually quite nice because we could have a lot of people looking at them at once, and so the kids could sort of refer to them together. I mean, everybody here has sort of seen what happens when you have 3 or 4 kids around a single laptop. You have the one kid has control of the keyboard. They're in control of everything, right? They're the gods in that space. Then you have the one other who's maybe talking to them over their shoulder, right? Then you have the third who's a little farther out, and the fourth one went to the bathroom like 15 minutes ago and you haven't seen him since, right? And so that wasn't particularly good for a kind of collaboration around a single thing. So we tried putting kids with a couple laptops around a large screen. What this was is, it's a little blurry and I apologize. It was kids making connections between math problems. And so they were looking at math problems and they'd assign all these tags to them. Because the teacher wanted the kids to understand that the math that they were doing could be approached in many different ways and had deeply interconnected domains, rather than the sort of how you learn it in the textbook, which is we're doing polynomials, and then we're going on to fractions, and we're doing this, and that they're all sort of discrete things. He was having exercises where they could do it, and then looking at how they answered these things together. And we found that this process of collaboratively tagging these problems actually helped kids answer them at a better rate than if they just went at it from a single lens alone. And so that was really good. And we worked with the teacher and he was like, that was cool, but I'd love to be able to have a little more control over the kinds of questions the kids get, the kinds of information that we visualize for them to help them understand these complicated problems. So we actually worked with this teacher again. He was also a physics teacher. And so we built a new thing, which was a portal that the teacher could use to create problem sets for the kids. And then we actually had them do it at home so they could answer the questions first. And we did this thing, was called tag, answer, and rationale. And so what they did is they had the tags around 20 physics principles that this problem might be connected to. They answered a multiple choice of what they thought. And then, it should be a little sharper, but this is them writing the rationales. And so they could see the rationales for all the kids in homework of how they were thinking about approaching this problem. And then in class, what we did is we had them work in groups and they looked at all of these different problems, and we're able to rationalize based on the principles that the other kids did in homework and their own sort of rationales about it, what they thought the answer was. And we took these problems out of the forced concept inventory, which is a set of problems that are really supposed to get kids to kind of answer wrong and reveal their misconceptions. And so we were able to have them discuss about what were the misconceptions and everything. And not terribly surprisingly, we found that when the kids had the aggregate answers of their peers, they did much better than when they did it alone and at homework, and also much better than even if they worked in groups without the aggregates of their peers. So the ability to use that as a reference point for their own thinking and discussion was productive. And again, this piece here was on the large displays that you saw in the last one. So we kind of changed the visualization. So here, that was it's all washed out, I apologize. That sort of network was what the kids saw as they were doing it. This time they saw the other problems. So that was a shared representation that allowed them to discuss and think. And we were like, great. So now we're starting to do this, and the teacher was like, what I'd like to do as well is the next thing is, know where I'm needed in the classroom. And so we were like, great. That required us to have some of that more of that real-time work built in. And so we said, let's build a dashboard to let you sort of know. It's around 2008, 2009, just before like iPads and everything and iPhones and all that came out. So we built a tablet application for the teacher. And we worked with him in co-design. All of this was in co-design. So we said what worked, what didn't. We built this, which was as groups were solving multiple choice problems, you could see what they got right, what they got wrong, and log through. Seemed really great, right? It failed spectacularly. It really, 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 really failed. Because what we found was the teacher would look at these things and he'd be like, oh, this group got this wrong. And he'd go up to them and he's like, hey, remember that thing you were doing like 5 minutes ago and you've already moved on from? Yeah, let's talk about that right now. And the kids were like, why would we do that? Right? And so what happened was the teacher put it down and I sat in the corner and was like, I'm bad at my job. Oh no. But what it really helped us do looks like I may have the same thing twice. Yeah, okay. What it really made us realize is, well, what is the role of a real-time device for teachers, right? What is it that it could actually help them do? And really it was more about this knowing when and where they were needed, when it was actually necessary. What's the temporality of the data? So after, I picked myself up off the floor, we said, okay, we learned a bunch of things from these earlier studies. We also found that while it was interesting for the kids to see the answers of their peers, it was a little too prescriptive because it was multiple choice, right? So how do we make this more about them, more open-ended and all of that? So we created a curriculum called PLACE, Physics Learning Across Contexts and Environments, and it took that smart room activity and actually tied it into a whole year curriculum, where we built something a little bit like Reddit, a social site, where kids could actually go out into the world, take pictures of examples of what they thought was physics in the world around them, and tagged it and added equations to all of it. So like there were examples of like a track meet, right? Another one which was funny but probably not appropriate was a kid dropping a ball on their sleeping brother, right? And it's like, look, force, acceleration. And I was like, that's kind of hilarious, but I'm not allowed to like say that. But it was awesome. And then they would all debate it and upvote and downvote the principles and the equation, all that. So connecting it into their real world and bring it back into the classroom. And we used all of this data as they put hundreds and hundreds of examples over the course of the year into a culminating activity. And this culminating activity had them solving what we call wicked problems in physics, and particularly Hollywood physics. So examples of like Iron Man, in the first one, I know we got to remember this is 2010, it was cool back then, the first Iron Man. Taking off into the air, and when he built his own suit, when he was in the cave and he was held by the bad guys, and then did a parabolic arc and crashed into a sand dune. We were like, could someone survive, could Iron Man survive that crash? A lot of complicated physics and things like that. There was another one, Tokyo Drift, Fast and Furious 2, again, 2010, it was cool. And one car jumps off a bridge and the other one goes behind it but going faster and clears the second car. Like, is that possible? So these kind of questions that took a lot to do. And they were using the evidence from all of the stuff they found out in the whole year to help them answer these questions. But what we had was, in this room this time, during this time we had tablets finally came out. This was like the origin. We're like, oh wow, we can actually have the kids move around in different ways and have information contextualized on this device in ways that were very different before, right? So depending on where they were in the room, there were 4 videos. When they signed into that space by going up to it, and basically we used first QR codes, and that wasn't work because it was a little dark, so we had them sign in manually. Again, we learned from what didn't work. When they signed into that room, they would get given information tagged to that space in the room. So wherever they went, the knowledge updated depending on where they were in the room. We had these large aggregate displays, right, which again, we use throughout this. And whatever kids did on their tablets would appear on this. So for example, one task might be tag this video with all of the different all the different physics elements you want. So kids would actually swipe up where they get delivered a whole bunch of tags on their tablet. They go like, this is acceleration or this is force. And as they did that individually, they would appear up on this screen, right, in real time. And then we had them negotiate in their groups, talk about, well, is it nope or yep, like it's these? And then based on that, the whole system would then give them new stuff. It would go to the database and be like, hey, these are all the tags that you guys agreed this is. Here are all the examples from when you were out in the real world with all of the equations and everything you did. Do any of these help you solve this problem? And so this whole room would constantly be updating and pulling from the database and giving them individualized, contextualized, and spatially indexed information. Here's, oh, it didn't show up right away. There we go. Here's the teacher tablet. So we completely redesigned it from the ground up. And this time what it did is it gave the teacher information about what was going on in the class, right? And so what it did is it allowed him to move the whole class through an activity. He'd press a button, all the screens in the room, all the tablets would update at once with the next task. If students needed information from the database, it would actually go and find the appropriate materials and give them to all the students. This is like a big deal. Imagine a teacher having to hand out new things. You've had kids give you like examples from physics in the real world, and some kids need them, other kids don't. You need to have like 10 piles of everything and go through it all. He could do that. He could see which activities they had finished. So if some groups were lagging behind, he could go and talk with them, and it might not be bad. They might be in some really deep physics discussion, which is great, rather than having something like Clippy go up and say, hey, looks like you're taking too long, you know. Maybe it's just a matter of getting them to discuss. And then also, at certain moments in the activity, it was actually pinging him to say, hey, you need to approve this. They're at a critical moment in their learning. Now is an important time for you to go talk with them. And it won't let them progress until you talk to the individual groups. So instead of that thing that was post-hoc after they'd already done something, the system knew when they were needed and went and talked to them at that time. And then we built a whole bunch of software agents. So software agents are little pieces of code that actually monitored what was going on in the class in real time and would respond as it emerged. And so we didn't know what things would actually fit these conditions. So it all had to happen as kids were interacting and doing things in the classroom. We had the bucket agent. Bucket agent basically took materials out of the database, like we said, and gave them out to kids as they were needed. In some cases, it was give, like, you know, if there were 4 people in the group and we wanted to evenly distribute, it would say, okay, there's like 30 items that fit the criteria based on their actions. Let's give the proper amount to each. So it'd be like 7 and then a couple extra. Sorting agent was one that put kids into new groups. We worked with the teacher in co-design. We said, hey, when you resort kids, what are the conditions you want them to have done? In one case it was, I want them to work with students they hadn't worked with at all during this activity. And as they're moving around the classroom, that's something we wouldn't know a priori. It was only as the kids were doing things, right? The consensus agent and the progress agent were 2 things that were basically just checking what kids were doing, making sure that they had reached consensus before they were allowed to go, and would send alerts to the teacher potentially or to them, letting them know what they had to be doing. And progress agent was something that just let us know where they were in the activities and were constantly updating. So again, all these little bits of code that were helping understand what was going on in the classroom. So now I'm going to just show you, I'm going to try to zoom through this because I don't want to spend too much time, but give you a sense of this. So here you see the kids in the classroom. This is the room. You get the size of it, not that big, but you know, they spread around the room. These are the tablets that they got. This showed them where they were going. This is their sort of drag and drop. So we designed all these elements. So you'll see here, see how things are appearing on the screen? That's as the kids are doing things in real time. I wonder if I can stop this without it completely running away. I'm a little worried. I'm going to talk fast on here, but you see how the screens are really big? See how the kids can talk to one another and it's a shared reference? So this is much better than a computer screen for kids to negotiate and have a shared object. Here's the teacher. He could actually sit in the middle of the class and look at all of these boards and know when and where he was needed based on what was going on. Again, a lot easier than this sort of curse of the laptop lid that I call it, right? Which is kids on laptops, you can't tell what they're doing. You know, we've all taught classes. You know half the kids are on Facebook. You just can't see it, right? So the idea here was helped him as an orchestration. This is actually really neat. This is one of the ambient displays, the things that sat at the edge of the class. and it would show when he regrouped in real time. Watch this, he pressed the button. This is not sped up. This is 20 kids being told where to go, going to their spot in the room, and starting the next activity. On average, it took 15 seconds. Like, I challenge anyone to group kids and get them onto a next activity and give them all the materials they need for it in less than 15 seconds. And so I really want to jump ahead here. Please let me click to the right spot. Oh, okay, here, great, and then I can skip forward. See this here? You know what's really hard, especially in 2009, 2010 to do? Solve physics problems on a tablet. It sucks. You have to draw the equations, do all this. You know what the best technology for that was? Pen and paper, right? So again, when I think about how I design things in these classrooms, I'm thinking about reducing friction. And so in some cases, the best technology for reducing friction for the kind of learning is pen and paper. But what the tablets had that were really good, and I think it was there at the end, is a camera. Mm-hmm. And so after the kids solved the physics problems using the stuff that was on the displays and answered it, was we had them record their answers. And we had 4 classes do this. And so what we did is in the follow-up is we played the answers for all 4 videos from all 4 classes so that the kids could discuss how the different groups came up with their different answers to help them think more about the physics reasoning. So use the tools that are most beneficial for supporting the kinds of learning you want to have happen. And sometimes it's rich infrastructures, interactive walls, and all these things. And sometimes it's a pen and paper. So just don't do technologies for technology's sake. And I'm going to show you how we understood the efficacy of these things. So this is one example of the kids' final answers, right? Again, paper, messy, physics, that's what we want. But we looked at how the stuff that they co-constructed was used to support their learning. And we found that overall, the kids used about 55% of the equations that they used that they said might be helpful for solving the problem, and about 76 to 77% of the variables and assumptions. I go into all of this, there are papers on this, like I'd spend an hour just on this piece, so just understand why I'm going through it a bit fast. And we're like, oh, that's really useful. They did use it, and it was meaningful for helping them to answer the questions, but we were curious, why did they only use about 55% of the equations? Mm-hmm. And they said that they actually kind of broke the system productively, right? They were like, well, until we got down to the nuts and bolts of actually solving it, we weren't sure which of all of these we would really need, right? They were able to set up the problem, which is really, really hard in physics. So they kept extra equations until they knew which ones they need, but they were able to set it up in those ways and go through those steps. So we thought that was really neat. You know, in terms of the system itself, was it able to sort people? And we were like, yes. So, you know, it wasn't, you know, in some cases this was like, how many tags did they do on the boards? This was the other sort. The teacher was like, I want the ones they did the most work on in the early stages of that activity when they were doing some swiping. And I want them to go at that board for the next one, right? Mm. In this case, this had 4 and 4 here, so it did a cascading model where it was like the first one you did 4 to, that's where we're gonna put you in. And then 3 for the next one. But it was successful in sorting the kids based on these emergent conditions, which we thought was really, really interesting. And the last thing that we looked at for this was, this is when the teacher actually went to go review the kids' work. Like I mentioned on the tablets, like, hey, you have to go look at the students' work. And in these steps, if the teacher didn't think that the kids were quite ready, he could send them back to do it again, right? And say, work on it a little bit more, and then ping me when you're ready to have it reviewed again. And so what we did is afterwards is we coded the kids' final setups before they solved the problem on a level of completeness, right? And we actually found that the teacher's intervention and looking at what the kids did and sending it back, we had 6 groups that had to go back and do it again, right? And the change in their completeness score in terms of the depth and the accuracy of setting up their problem improved significantly than before the intervention. So what that meant was the ability of the teacher to know when and where he was needed in the class and being able to intervene, talk with the students, and potentially send them back to do some more work at this critical moment in their activity had a statistically significant impact in the quality of their final answers. So that's really important. That's a hard thing to do. Lots of moving parts, lots of things. Teacher was able to know when and where he was needed. So next, that was my PhD, and it was awesome, and I loved being there, but eventually you have to graduate, like all of you are, and some of you have recently graduated, which is awesome too, right? So I then moved on to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, And I had the opportunity to work in an informal digital learning space. So moving from formal classrooms into an informal at the New York Hall of Science, right? Which is one of the most diverse children's science centers in the world, because it's in Queens, New York, and it has a multitude, but not a plurality of any one particular background. Super interesting, big, really interesting, different socioeconomic backgrounds, lots of school trips, people coming from all over. I was like, sweet. And I got to work on this project called OzTalk. And OzTalk is an interactive tabletop exhibit where participants, and again, the great thing about Informal Museum is that you've got parents, kids, everybody coming in together, right? And so they come in and they're actually, the narrative is that they're engineers working with a set of biologists who are in the Amazonian rainforest. And you go into this cave, which is just a room off the main exhibit, but it's all dark and kind of cool. And in the middle of it is this table, which is a pool, and teeming in his never before seen aquatic life. And the kids aren't told anything else other than this is it, right? And so they start to explore on their own. And these blocks are different kinds of things like circuits, resistors, batteries, LEDs, timers, and they start playing. And they, if they build the right kind of circuit, that is the right ratio of batteries, resistors, and LEDs, the circuit glows. And then that draws the fish out. And they're not really fish, they're like aquatic animals. And then the kids start to realize that, and just as a caveat, when I say kids, some of these kids were like 70 years old, right? So it's like kids, it's museums, right? The kids started to realize that, if we, building certain circuits draws them out. And so they got to try to figure out all this stuff about circuitry, but we didn't tell them anything. It was for them to decide how they were tinkering and exploring, right? So I'll show you, you can get a little bit of a sense. I'm not going to go too long, but oh yeah, cool. So you can see how those are the fish that come out, right? Kind of funky, futuristic. And so they design things. But what's really interesting about this is, again, we didn't tell them what to do. We give them a lot of feedback, right? So the circuit blew there because there was too much power, right? In other cases, it'll because there's not enough, right? That was an early, but it looked much cooler when it was fully sketched out. But yeah, you get the sense that there's a lot of exploration going on in here. And what's really interesting to me, again, when I think about this notion of the physical space, information, and technology, is that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here as these kids work. The way it's designed is that there were 4 zones on this table, so that players could be in their own space and working on it, but it's visible to everybody, right? And circuits could actually cross between those borders, right? But there's a lot of information going on here, a lot of opportunity to see with each other, learn from each other, right? So there's a couple, right? There's the actual table itself as an augmented space for information, and where you're standing around the table will impact what you see and the sense making you do around it. Like I just showed you in the video, things pop, flash, the fish swim out, all of that. That's one layer of information that can support the kids in their learning. There's the blocks themselves. The blocks as objects to think with, right, and discuss with. You see what other people are using at the table. You can actually reach over and take one, right, and bring it into your space, or take one of yours and put it into someone else's space. Them as a negotiable object of understanding and knowledge is a pretty powerful tool. Then there's the kids themselves, right, that they can look across the table at each other. This is a really nice orientation for that. Because you have kids on both sides of the table looking at and across at each other, you can look at what each other are saying, look at what they're doing, right? Talk to each other across the table. And you can actually see there's only 4 spaces, but there's 5 kids here. It was pretty often that you'd have someone standing here at the edge watching 2 or 3 people and commenting on what everyone else was doing as sort of a legitimate peripheral participant at the side of these kids' exploration. And then also, finally, there's the ambient display at the back. This showed all of the fish that everyone had caught. And so you might see that player 3, you got this big blue fish. How did you do that? What were you doing, right? And so this again was an object for kids to recognize their own exploration or understanding within the context of the other people who were there, right? And so one of the things that's really interesting about this OzTalk exhibit is that it was open-ended and exploratory. The kids didn't come in with a particular goal that they were told they had to do, which is a little rare. Often when you're in a classroom or something, it's like, you're going to learn this or you're going to do this, right? And so they were free to collaborate or not, right? They could work with others, they could do their own thing, and also because it's a museum exhibit, people came and left at different times. So someone might have learned something, and then somebody else came, and they may have talked to each other, and the first person left, and the second person got a little bit of that understanding, and then maybe helped them, and then carried it on to the next person. In some cases, some people stayed for an hour, and they learned from everyone who came and kept doing things as people came and went. So we wanted to understand how this played out in terms of collaboration, right? And the knowledge sharing that this afforded. And so what we found was that with very little friction, OzTalk allowed people to move from individual, collaborative, back to individual and parallel goals, right? And that it helped newcomers come up to speed in some really interesting ways. And we actually found this. This actually took a lot. I was watching a lot of video, because that's what you do, right? And we also had the log files, and I'd look at some of these kids. I'm like, wow, this kid built like 30 circuits. That's amazing. They must have done really well. And then I went back to the video, and I watched, and they made the same circuit 30 times in a row. They literally just took the same blocks and went like this, plop, 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 and I was like, oh, wow, that's not like super useful, right? And we also found that, yeah, surprise, surprise, right? But that, you know, that was some of the stuff we did. We also found that in OzTalk, there were lots of ways when people collaborated and they actually didn't have the same goals, right? So we often think about when people collaborate that there's a convergence on a shared understanding of what the goal is, right? And that has often been the hallmark of effective collaboration. Do people converge on the same understanding of the goal, and how do they work towards that goal? In this, we might actually be working together for different things, building different circuits, trying to capture different fish. And that often isn't talked about in the literature. So we were like, well, what's happening here when we have people doing different things, productively, unproductively, but possibly for different goals or divergent goals while still collaborating together? So we came up with this idea of divergent collaboration. And we looked and we built up, building on another framework about collaborative learning mechanisms that was around tabletops, but was very locked around this idea that it was shared goals and understanding. We then actually had to think about, well, there's more things going on here that could still be productive. And if we looked at OzTalk through the traditional lenses of convergence, then we would have missed all of these really interesting learning opportunities that happened in here. And so we developed this new coding framework, and we actually looked at it. And so here's an example of some parents. Again, a little darker, but that's fine. Just know that there's a son, a dad, and a mom around this table, right? And this is just a little vignette, but it's like, it was really interesting. See, actually up here it says, you know, I've got 10, and that was like a score for catching a fish, right? And then the dad and the mom, or the dad and the son are like, yeah, you have no points, mom, you have no points, right? And she was like, I don't need points. Right? She's like, forget you guys. I don't need points, right? And so then she started doing other tinkering in the space. She started doing other stuff, not chasing those points, and trying bigger circuits, right? And the kid actually saw the mom building these bigger circuits and was like, what happens when you have 2 batteries? Because the mom had done that, and of course the kid decided that that was something he'd come up with. Fine, I don't care, right? I'm excited that he decided to try 2 batteries. He's like, I want to see what happens when you have 2 batteries. And they started talking about that, even though they had different goals. So then it went on, and they started talking about what happens if you build these bigger circuits, right? The kid wanted to get more points. The mom actually just wanted to experiment and develop different circuits and try it out. They had different goals into why they were doing it, but they were able to collaborate on reasoning about what happened. And in the end, they built this bigger circuit that had a bigger fish come out, and everyone got real excited. And it spurred them onto these whole new opportunities to explore and try out in this space, right? And we may have missed that if we were looking at, well, they didn't converge on a goal, but they did actually were able to work together to go in new ways of investigation. And so I mentioned briefly about that one young participant who built 30 circuits the same way, right? And depending on how you looked at that, it may have actually been classified as productive to you. But what we found is that actually wasn't productive. We sat around, we talked, it's like, oh, some of this stuff actually isn't particularly productive, even though it looks that way. So could we start to understand the kinds of circuits that they were building, right? Were they productive? Or the kinds of exploration and tinkering they're doing, was it productive or unproductive, right? And so what we actually did is we coded every circuit that, that every participant made. And you can read the paper, but we actually took a long time understanding what the primitive or what the baseline event was going to be. And a circuit was a really good one because it often triggered a lot of things in the system. And so every circuit that somebody made, we coded as simple or complex because we found a three-element circuit, one battery, one resistor, one LED, was the minimum that you could do to make a fish. And very few people ever made it past a 3-block circuit. And something like 80% of all people stayed at a 3-block circuit. So we want to know, did you go to a more complex configuration, right? Did it work or not, right? Did it have the right ratios of batteries, resistors, LEDs, right? You could have a 10-block circuit. It's complex, but it's not working at all, right? Was it a copy of one you'd done before or a unique one? Was that the first time you had built that circuit? So that one girl who did 30 of the same circuit? Well, you know, it was a simple, working copy, right? And the other was it an echo? So an echo is that did it have the same primitives as somebody else who was at the table? So it might be the same number of LEDs, same number of batteries, same number of resistors. The LEDs might be different colors because you could have red, blue, or green. But was it basically the configuration the same, or were you the first person since you arrived at the table to do that, right? So was that a completely original design of your own? And so what we did is we looked at all of those and we coded every single circuit that was ever made in the exhibit over the weeks and weeks and weeks. Yeah, not manually. So this is the magic. What we actually did is we actually did it in Python. And so this is the magic of, yeah, I see a lot of nods, right. So this is the magic of why I talk about, you know, combining analytics with qualitative. The qualitative showed us that this was a problem. The data mining, and then we basically, once we did this, we actually were able to know, we created all of these sort of sub things to know when someone arrived at the table, all the circuits they made, we had it all coded out. And so what we found was we were able to effectively design a hidden Markov model and a hidden Markov model basically lets you know at any point in time a state of what someone did. And we coded it as productive or unproductive. It's, without getting too far down, it's something that is never inherent. So it could be that the first non-working circuit you make could be productive because you're trying something out. But if you do that a bunch of times, it's probably not productive anymore if you're doing the same circuit again and again. So this combination of things, we were able to, you know, accurately, you know, again, you can look at this paper about the accuracy, but it was about area under the curve score was 0.8, which is actually really high, which is how likely versus random that it was actually correct, because we coded, after it did it, we hand coded hundreds of them ourselves and compared it to whether it was productive or not. So it was very accurate in it. And so we had every single circuit that anyone had ever made in this system as coded as productive or unproductive. And then what we did is we said, okay, let's see what happens when people move through these different states. So we built a Markov model that showed this, and it was really interesting. What happened was, when someone was new to the table, 68% of the time they were productive. That's pretty right. You know, you haven't done anything yet. You're probably, you know, building a new circuit. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, who knows, right? And then you tended to stay once you were productive 69% of the time your next movement. What was really interesting, though, was once you became unproductive, you started falling into this pattern of doing unproductive tinkering. You stayed there 89% of the time. And you only went back to being productive 3% of the time. So once you started falling into these sort of traps of being unproductive, you were going to stay there or leave, right? You were very unlikely to become productive again, right? And so we were really interested in what does that mean? If we have people who are going from sustained unproductivity, right? So we wanted to actually look at what was happening in those rare moments. So if you almost never made it productive, right? What was going on when you became productive? Like that 3% of the time, what was going on there? What was causing the rare number of kids to actually become productive, right? And so what we actually did is, we did exactly what I was saying. We blended the analytics with the qualitative, getting the how from the what, right? How did these kids at 3% of the time actually make it from that state? So we used our hidden Markov model, right? Plus our DCLM, which was the interaction framework, right? And equals learning love, right? And so what we actually did is, out of all of the instances where this happened, where people were sustained unproductivity, which we said had to be at least 3 periods of unproductive, 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 and became productive, there were 284 transitions of that. We did interaction analysis using the DCLM approach to those. The reason we only did 22 was because we needed really complete, full data of everything that was going on. And the audio was slightly unsynced and things like that, so it was a little bit harder than others. But we applied the DCLM to those interactions. And what we found, which was really good, was that 20 of the 22 were correctly identified. So 91% of the things where the hidden Markov said this was one of these, it actually was a transition. And we did that by watching what they did later and saw, did they build new circuits, did they think in new ways? So it was accurate, which made us feel good about our model, right? 19 of the 20 transitions, the students who moved from unproductive state to a productive, engaged in a collaborative learning mechanism that we identified earlier in our earlier work. And we went even, and of those, the ones that really stood out were boundary spanning, which was this idea that looking at what others are doing, right, or, reaching out and acting in, or someone reaching out and acting into your space were the most common forms of support that allowed people to make those transitions. So what that meant was the ability to see what others were doing or engage with others while you were doing what you were doing were major forms of support for helping you get out of these unproductive ruts. And so then we were like, great, now we're starting to understand how people make these transitions. So what we ended up doing, and we only got to try it a little bit before I left because all good postdocs have to come to an end, it's unfortunate, but we built tablets that actually took the real-time data, and when we saw people getting stuck in these unproductive states, based on the kinds of unproductive states they had, we gave a museum docent alerts of the ways in which they might be struggling, and then prompts that would help them work with this, or like give a little prompt that still kept agency. So rather than say, you're doing it wrong, it's this, right? We don't want Clippy, we don't want people telling you what to do. It was things like, what's different between what that person you're doing and the person next to you is doing, right? So getting them, understanding the kinds of prompts that get them to reflect and think deeply about their own processes and those of others, because we knew that was something that was helpful to help kids overcome these unproductive states. And so that was the end of that period, and now I'm gonna, and what was really interesting to me was, again, this idea that where you were in the room, right, what you were interfacing with, how we designed those things were deeply important to the kinds of learning that was taking place, right? Understanding, like, if those kids were at their own tablets in different spots in the room, they would be unable to see what others were doing. They would not have been able to do the kind of boundary spanning we wanted. The lack of shared representation that allowed them to talk to each other would have been challenging for them to discuss and debate what was going on. And so recently, I just came into University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and we've started looking at this again. And so we're looking at other forms of immersive, embodied, and interdependent simulations. This idea of what some people do in one space can impact and connect with others in this space. Again, and so what we're doing now is this idea, again, spatially indexed learning collaboration. In our current work, we're still really interested in this individual, small group, whole interactions. Understanding how we design the visualizations and interfaces to support people at each of those planes. You can't have the same information at all three spots. It's going to be overloading information. It's going to be inefficient. You're not going to give the kids things. What you need in a whole class discussion is probably not what you need for just you and I to talk together, right? Really interested in how knowledge diffusion, like goals, move around the classroom, right? Like, how do ideas, like if I know something in a physical classroom, how is it that somebody else gets that? When I walk across the room and we start talking about a concept, how do I support that? And then how do I know when it's happening, right? How do we capture all of these really interesting ideas about knowledge propagating around the room? And then also, how kids' strategies in these games or in their learning evolve over time, right? What is it about how they're playing in the simulation, how they're talking with others, how all these things play out? And so I'm going to give you, again, this idea about design. And we had a first version of this, which we called Lead Caravan. And in Lead Caravan, you were star traders, okay? And you had your planet, and all the planets had a shared type, like 10 different goods. that you could trade with the other planets in the solar system. But each of your planets has its own economy. So we had funny things like kittens. Kittens might be really like popular in your planet. Everyone wants to buy kittens, right? And they might not be very popular on another planet, but they really want diamonds. I don't know, diamond kittens are worth about the same to me, right? I actually prefer kittens, but that's a me thing. But, so they might really want to buy diamonds, right? So you would run around the room. This is a demo with just some people who were playing it, and this was so washed out, I apologize. But you'd have to actually physically go around the room and talk with the other people like, oh, who needs diamonds or who's selling kittens and all these sorts of things, right? To get people to understand about these complex interdependent economies, right? Because if you bought a lot of kittens and started selling them in your market, demand would go down, right? And so there's like an economic trading sim that also required people to engage with others, and it ran for several rounds. And we had different things at different spots in the room. So this was your planets. I know it's very washed out, but trust me, it's very well designed. But this was your planet, and so you saw the economy of your planet, and only you saw that, because that's a strategic advantage. If people knew how much it was worth for you, you could share that with them, but that was up to you. So you just had this on one tablet. Then you had how you traded, right? And so you had an individual phone that you could go up to other people and say, okay, what do you want to trade? These are our values, our stock that we have. But you didn't actually see the values as they were changing, because that was only something you saw at your home planet, right? And then here you can sort of see it up there. That was the total global economy. So as you bought and sold things, the value of your economy, so you were competing with everybody else, you see like, oh man, their economy's worth more than ours, right? And so we had people playing this, and they were really engaging in this simulation, and we found them really thinking deeply about the economies. But it only had that sort of one level, and while we found it really useful, we're like, there's really more we can kind of do with these kind of spaces where people are moving around, engaging, and things change both at the local and dynamic game-wide level. So the current one we're working on right now is called City Settlers. Very similar in some ways, but also, uniquely different in that what it is, has everybody here played like SimCity or Civilization or something like that? So, in a class of 30 kids, we would have groups of about 3 to 4, and we're going to be launching this in April, so you're seeing it sort of in its evolutionary processes. And each group is its own city in a territory. And where you are located in the room physically situates you on top of a geographical placement of this space. Okay? And you're building a city, you're buying buildings, you're like factories, farms, parks, that do things, produce goods, some clean up, pollution, all of this. And you move around the room, and so you have these different factors. The things you're producing, you could also produce pollution, your population, your happiness level. And so the things you do in this game, yeah, it's a happy sloth, I love it, is that, impact your city, right? In many different ways. So like, and not all of them are clear what results in what, so the kids have to explore and see, right? And they manage their cities. But what happens is, let's say your pollution gets really high. If it gets too high, it will actually start to pollute the neighbors next to you. And some of the other things that you do in the game will have cascading effects with other groups. So you have to really understand how, what you're doing has a broader impact. And we don't actually tell the kids what success is in this game. For some, it might be, we want the biggest city. For others, it might be, I want the cleanest city. For others, it might be, I want the one that produces the most goods. Or I want the one with the biggest population. Or I want the one that everyone else in the class doesn't hate me, right? We're the most respected, or we do the most trade. And so we allow for multiple goal setting. We aren't actually telling them what the right one is. And so, again, we have this idea of trading. So again, you might not have the resources you need to buy a particular building. So you're going to have to go talk with other groups. They may be producing it, right? It may be that where you are on the map, you may have access to special resources, right? You have water, so you may have access to fish or other things. But if you overdo it, you can gut it out, right? And people are like, you're getting rid of the fish, or somebody else might be polluting and it's hurting the fish there. And so you have all of these deeply interconnected things. And just as to show you again, this is what your city view is, right? So this shows you they have a farm, a park, and a factory. They produce some stuff. We're working on the interface right now. We actually are starting to work with some HCI students to understand how we design this so it's intuitive, the kids make sense of what's going on. And so we built this thing, while there's lots going on and they have to talk about all these independent factors, we made it very lightweight and very easily reskinnable. And so what we're actually doing right now is we're working with 4 middle school classrooms. And so they're working in pairs. And one is actually a history class and a science class. And they're working together to play this game. And the science class is interested in the connection between population, resources and energy, and pollution, and how those things all affect each other. And the teacher right now, it looks like the way it's going to time out is going to be the Renaissance era. So we're actually going to take all of this stuff and we're going to wrap it in that period in history. So the buildings, the resources, all of this stuff. I have to admit I'm not the best on Renaissance like energy sources, but we're trying to figure it out, right? But we're working in deep co-design with the teachers to do this. We're not designing at, we're designing with. It's going to be in 6 months. We're already talking with them. It might actually be like poop, might be like a fuel source. Like that's a thing. People, but if you're producing too much poop, that's not healthy, right? In many levels, right? But you know what I mean? So that might actually create less happiness or more sickness, even though you're producing a major resource, right? You might need to get cows for that, which will require other things. So what are the factors they need to grow their city and understand that? So we're able to tie history and science together in ways that kids are embodying it, right? And they're doing it. The other thing I should have mentioned is that the way City Settlers works is it's a turn-based game, right? So we say, okay, everybody go talk with everybody you want to, make your decisions, figure out what buildings you want to buy, what factories or things you want to turn on, and we give them about 3 minutes. And then when everyone's ready, we click a button, everything resolves at once, right? So it's not one of these things that's running, so they have to worry and do things very fast. We want them to think. And we want them to think between rounds. And the way we've designed it is that with the teachers, they could do 1 round at the beginning of each class, right? And say that okay, what happened in this class? How does this tie back into the things we're learning or understanding in our class right now? They could play 5 rounds. They could play for an hour if they wanted to, and then use that as a launching in point. So what we're doing is we're designing it in ways that give the kids a sense of really being a part of the kind of science, kind of history, the kind of inquiry that is happening off the screen as well. And so we're working with the teachers really carefully to design the non-digital materials. They want journals for the kids in between rounds. Like, here's how my city is right now. Here's how it's similar or dissimilar to the kinds of stuff we're learning historically. Here's what we need to do because of our energy needs, right? And so tying this in a deeply integrated way into the kind of curriculum that's going on in the classroom, right? And so we're really excited about this. I'll let you know. I'll come back in 6 months and tell you all the ways it worked and all the ways it really didn't, because you have to be mindful of both. I know we aren't doing it all right the first time. That's the magic of design. So, and as I mentioned, it's lightweight and easy and adaptable. What we're trying to develop is a framework for rich learning scenarios, right? That can really engage. The other one I should mention is ancient civilizations, and I think it's going to be Rome. We aren't sure. But then again, the buildings and everything will be there, so the kids get to be in Rome in 600 AD or wherever, or even, I don't know when, we're working on this one, and I'm not a Roman expert, this is why I'm working with the teachers. They're the experts in this, and we're going to work together on this, right? Customizable specific domains, flexible scripting and orchestration. The way in which they want to use this in the class is highly adaptable to the kinds of learning needs and the kind of progressions they want. This is really super important. Fun game and sound pedagogy. It has to be both. Far too often, learning games, super fun, terrible learning, right? Or, hey, we're going to do Math Blaster. This game sucks, right? And so the whole time we're designing these things, we're constantly having conversations with, there were a couple mechanics we want to build in. And we're like, okay, that makes the game fun, but is it going to take away? Is it just going to become a game, right? We have to really be careful about when we design these things, what we're doing it and why we're doing it for. It can be very easy to make a pithy, learningless game, right? We want to understand how all these things tie in together, and we constantly are testing to understand, is it doing what we want it to do? And if it's not, we have to recheck our assumptions. We, again, design-based research and, building off what Bill Sandoval talks about, conjecture-based, design-based research. We have conjectures on how this is going to help learning. We also have conjectures about how the game will play, right? So we're actually looking at it on multiple levels here. It has to be engaging and enjoyable, or you're going to lose the class, right? Nothing's worse than making kids play a crappy game, because then they're going to hate the game, and they're going to hate the subject, and you're better off just not even doing the game, right? And again, this idea of learner-defined goals. Within this, we're keeping it open so that they feel agency, right? Nothing's worse than a thing where everyone feels like they know where they're going to end up, and they're checked out because it really doesn't matter what I do, because we're all going to end up at X. right? And so in this, we're actually they're going to be excited about, ooh, I want to do this, and I want to do that, and all these sorts of things. So I'm going to close here. There's a couple last things that, like all of this, that I'm really excited about moving forward on top of this. Oh, it's a really slow animation from this. New forms of persistent and ambient representations. How do we show things to the kids in ways that could be there all the time? I mean, I have to give homage to Tom Moore, who's over there, because a lot of this stuff was inspired by work I did with him over the years. Understanding what we show all the time, sometimes at the periphery. Kids don't need all the stuff all the time. How do we design for that? And how do we design that stuff to exist, again, at the individual, small group, and whole class levels, right? Knowledge, awareness, and social presence, right? To me, it's like, what do others know, or how do I know how I can connect kids in ways that helps them learn? Or how do I understand how this knowledge is spreading through the class in new ways? When somebody goes and talks to somebody, about dung for energy, right? And that changes how they think about it, and then I hear them use that phrase with their group or another group. How do we understand those? Or how do we find those moments where it's really useful to connect two kids together to have them talk, right? And augmented and immersive and distributed spaces. Again, a lot of my work is thinking about this, right? What are new ways to augment it, right? I'm really interested in how we could give new lenses into these spaces in augmented ways, possibly with AR, right? When you and I go up and look at a particular spot in the physical layout of the classroom, because we're working on the same city together, do we see different things about that environment that are helpful for us to understand versus others, right? Mm-hmm. Or can we inscribe things to it that help us understand and talk with one another, right? Can we do things like we've talked about within these cities? Can I look at my city and see an augmented version of it to get a better sense of the health or the environmental conditions, right? How can we let them see things in new ways that help them make sense of both the learning domain and themselves and their peers within it? So I'm going to stop there because I am officially a minute and a half over my time. But thank you so much for letting me talk with you today, and I'd be really happy to talk with you about everything, anything at all, and what you really liked or didn't like about my talk. I'm open to both. So thank you once again.